Hi, welcome everyone to the LenFest News Philanthropy Summit. We're so excited to have you here, and we're so excited to have you at our first breakout session. Is there a new normal in philanthropy with Rashonda Mahone, who is the Assistant Dean for Advancement and Alumni Engagement at Emory University's Business School. I'm going to let her introduce herself, and then we are going to view a recording. I'm also about to place a Google Doc that everyone will have access to with session notes in the chat. So please do reference that. But we're going to watch a recording of a presentation Rashonda did recently at a summit at a network session. And then we're going to have sort of an opportunity for live Q&A. So she's here to introduce herself, and I will turn it over to her.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, hello all, and thank you for joining the session on Is There a New Normal in Philanthropy? I'm excited to be back and to also listen to the presentation, just kind of giving highlights from the Giving USA and various reports. So I look forward to engaging after the recording is played and to learn more from everyone. And thank you, Rebecca and the LenFest Institute for having me. And I'm excited to keep the conversation going.
Thanks for everything.
All right, well, thank you. I'm going to get set up with our, I should say, the new normal of all things related to digital. But thank you, Annie. It's so great to be here with everyone. As she mentioned, my name is Rashonda Mahone, and I'm a member of the Inclusion Firm and honored to be here to present to you, Is There a New Normal in Philanthropy, as part of the LenFest News Philanthropy Network. As Annie mentioned, I've been privileged to work in this space for over 20 years, almost 21, and believe my passion and calling is the work we do for our organization. So to everyone who supports the work of advancement and philanthropy, I salute you. I know it's challenging and rewarding at the same time. So thank you so much for joining. And in my spare time, which sometimes is very limited, I do browse LinkedIn often, and about a month ago, I came across this post, and I definitely know what you're thinking. The cardinal rule of presentations, even virtual, is to not have this many words on a slide. But I thought to begin this presentation with this post, and I'm just going to quickly read it to you. A wealthy white man walked into a bar in Miami. As soon as he entered, he noticed an African woman, Black, sitting in one corner. He walked over to the counter, removed his wallet, and shouted, "Bartender, I'm buying drinks for everyone in this bar except that Black woman over there." The bartender collected the money and began serving free drinks to everyone in the bar except the African woman. Instead of becoming upset, the Black woman simply looked up at the guy and shouted, "Thank you." This infuriated the wealthy guy. So once again, he took out his wallet and shouted, "Waiter, this time I'm buying bottles of wine and additional food for everyone in this bar, except for that African sitting in the corner over there." The bartender collected the money from the man and began serving free food and wine to everyone in the bar, except the African. When the waiter finished serving the food and drinks, the African woman simply smiled at the man and said, "Thank you." That made him furious. So he leaned over to the counter and asked the bartender, "What is wrong with that Black woman? I have bought food and drink for everyone in the bar except for her. And instead of becoming angry, she just sits there and smiles at me and shouts, 'Thank you.' Is she mad?" The bartender smiled at the wealthy man and said, "No, she is not mad. She is the owner of this establishment." So this post caught my eye for several reasons. First, I am from Miami, Florida, and I identify as a Black woman. And I too go to bars and sit in the corner by myself. Just joking, but seriously, I too have been underestimated because of how I look. So what was interesting to me about this post was really the feedback, and it came in all forms. The URL that you see at the bottom of the screen, you can definitely check out the post and read the comments. In fact, there were over 10,000 reactions to this post, and over 1,000 comments. And these comments range from positive rose-colored glasses about the parable and the moral of the story, all the way to the vitriol and disdain for posting this on LinkedIn and fake news. Now, for the prospect researchers in here on the webinar, I hope you keep me honest, because the person that you see pictured here, who I have not been able to confirm, is Genevieve Ananji, a Nigerian actress. And from what I can tell, she does not own a bar in Miami. I shared this story because, yes, there is a new normal. From the ease and access and reach of information to the increased demands for transparency, we all know what they say about the speed of news, or the speed at which bad or negative news travels faster than good news. This new normal is in every aspect of our lives. And because of the pandemic and the social justice movement and the political climate and overall business disruption, philanthropy is not immune. So during this session, I will do my best not to bore you, but the trends do describe the impact of the new normal. And I will intersperse what is new as a result of the trends, and then close with a few recommendations on what you and your organization can do to be prepared and be successful in this new time of philanthropy, especially what we should be doing in the future. So I'm going to look at a few trends. I believe the go-to source for all national trends in philanthropy is the Giving USA and the annual report of philanthropy. Giving USA is an initiative of the Giving USA Foundation, or the Giving Institute, which endeavors to advance philanthropy through research and education. The annual report of philanthropy is the most comprehensive report on charitable giving in the United States. And the most recent report, released earlier this year, reflects giving based on 2020 tax returns that we submit to the IRS. And it pretty much captures all of the charitable giving throughout the events of the calendar year. I will share a few slides that highlight some of the trends that this report found. Now, unfortunately, Giving USA does not outline trends based on race, region, or age. But in August of this year, Indiana University and the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy released the Everyday Donors of Color report. This report sought to examine the specific motivations and practices of philanthropy from donors of color. The report addressed motivations of donors, the motivations for giving for donors of color, the specific tools and techniques that donors of color use, and the organizations that benefit from the support of racial and social justice. And then finally, I will briefly mention trends in journalism, and I'll admit I may need audience participation for that one. So to begin, on the bright side of this new normal is that over $471 billion was contributed to charitable organizations in 2020. This is the highest amount ever recorded in the Giving USA's 40-year history of documenting charitable giving. And what you see on this slide, this pie chart divides the source of those contributions. And as you can tell, majority of the philanthropy in the United States is given by individuals. But if you factor in bequests, that 9%, if you add them both, individuals and bequests together, the share increases to about $366 billion, or about 78% that is given by individuals. Now, the trend of individuals doing the heavy lifting in charitable contributions in the United States is not a new normal. However, looking back over the years, what is new is the growth in foundations. And I'm sure many of you are starting to see the rise of family foundations and other foundations that are doing more to not only attract donors to them, but also how they give gifts and grants. What is on the decline is corporations. And I will note that corporate giving is closely aligned to not only the US gross domestic product, the GDP, but also corporate pre-tax dollars. And what Giving USA cites is that a lot of corporate giving also comes in the form of gift in kind. So if you haven't done this type of analysis for your organization, I would strongly recommend that you look at the source of philanthropy for your organization and see how it compares to the national trends. And we'll talk a little bit about how to address the individuals, corporations, and foundations a little bit later in the presentation. So this chart
is just a 40-year span of charitable giving in America. Each of the gold lines that you see are recession years. And for the exception of 1987, 2008, and 2009, charitable giving in America has at least been flat or increased in current dollars. So 40 years of growth is certainly incredible. And the good news is that trends are in our favor and giving is on the rise. And from all indications so far in 2021, I know we're almost closely, I can't believe it's November very soon, but we're almost at the end of 2021. I imagine that when the report comes out next year, that we will continue to see an increase in giving in America. So that is, again, some good news. Now, this next chart depicts how the $471 billion was dispersed across the various organizations. And so as you see, Recipient Organization is basically categorized by the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities, the NTTE. So every 501c3 charitable organization has that categorization. And so the trends, as you see on this chart, are fairly consistent over the last few years. Religion has and continues to be the largest slice of giving in America. And we'll talk a little bit about that as it relates to donors of color. I imagine for most of you in the audience that your organization will fall under arts, culture, and humanities, which is the 8th largest slice of the pie by way of recipient organization. I do want to share that a trend that happened from 2019 to 2020 is that arts, culture, and humanities, as well as health, were the 2 sectors out of all of the sectors to experience a decline in charitable giving. Every other sector saw an increase in giving compared to 2019. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the presentation as well. So to kind of hone in, this chart really shows that decline, as I just mentioned. In 2019, arts, culture, and humanities raised about $21 billion. And so there is a slight decline from 2019 to 2020 with $19 billion given to organizations that fall under the umbrella. And so as you see, there is growth and a little bit of contraction and decline. And I would imagine the arts piece probably took a large hit because of the pandemic, with everything shutting down from our theaters to entertainment options and different things to engage our donors. I would imagine that that is really a large source of the decline in this sector. This slide, I think, is a really interesting one that charts out the number of 501c3 organizations in America over an 11-year span. This is a new normal, and that is competition. In 2019, there were over 1.3, almost 1.4 million charitable organizations in the country. And so I share this to everyone that it is becoming increasingly harder to differentiate our organizations among the many others. And so we have to be relentlessly consistent with our message of impact and purpose for our organizations. So not only that we can retain the donors that we have, but we have the better ability to attract new donors. So something that I always keep my eye on is this growth in the number of nonprofit organizations in the country. So the bottom line for Giving USA, I find that this data is really good to answer 2 key questions. Does your organization mirror the trends nationally? And where should you focus your efforts? And so if I could give you my bottom line, with this new normal in philanthropy, number 1, this is the highest level of giving that we've experienced. How did your organization fare? Based on the current progression, as I mentioned, 2021 is indicating the same growth will be experienced, but we'll see after the close of this year. So that is the good news. The second bottom line is individuals are the top source of philanthropy in America. So does your donor base reflect the same source for your organizations as the national trends? If you're relying on foundations and corporations, or specifically corporations, again, be mindful that there is a large correlation or a high correlation to the gross domestic product and pre-tax corporate profits. And there also is that competition for gift in kind. But if individuals are your top source, I would certainly encourage you to think about bequests and legacy giving. And if your organization doesn't have the resources, I'm going to share a couple of them at the end of the presentation on how you can include planned giving and estate giving as part of the conversation with individuals. The other thing is to be mindful of foundations. They are on the rise. Many of your community foundations and grant giving foundations have certainly done their share of giving. And based on tax codes and how people park their money, that is something that you should also be mindful of. And finally, as I alluded to a little earlier, the arts, culture, and humanities sector, they did experience a decline this past year. How does that look for you and your organization this year? How do you level off and continue to differentiate and retain the donors that you have and try to upgrade their giving? So again, I do love the information that is given in Giving USA. But one of the challenges is again, it doesn't address region, race, or age. And so, as I mentioned, Indiana University and the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, in collaboration with a nonpartisan research organization at the University of Chicago, they aim to fill the gap in academic research focused on philanthropy across diverse communities. And so through a national survey that was conducted in September 2020, they did a series of focus groups comprised of diverse donors. They were able to obtain a better understanding of donors of color and their response to the philanthropic landscape. So in this report, they cited several giving patterns of donors of color. They talked about the motivations, the major motivations for donors of color. And as you saw in the Giving USA report, faith and religious tradition is the #1 driver of giving from donors of color. Another is self-help, just fighting against racial or ethnic oppression in the donor's own racial or ethnic group. Reciprocity, feeling excluded from mainstream culture. Many organizations and donors of color have come together to share an economic reciprocity among each other. And then leveling the playing field. And this is the idea that giving future generations or younger generations a better opportunity than what is currently presented. So those are 4 major motivations. And again, if your organization can tap into any one of those, you're really on the right track. Now, as far as the types of organizations that donors of color give to, again, religion, houses of worship, religious groups, top option and a top source of where donors of color contribute their giving. Education-related organizations like universities, K through 12, that is another organization that donors of color invest heavily in through philanthropy. Civil rights and arts organizations, especially if it's within their own ethnic group, that's another place that donors of color give. And something that I did not expect is ethnic financial institutions or institutions who provide access to capital, such as bank loans to diverse constituents. That is another organization that donors of color tend to give their support to. And then finally, channels, small groups. This is something that is starting to come up more and more within donors of color. Giving circles and online platforms as well, but the idea that donors give to people they know and people they trust. Trust and transparency is certainly important, especially with the idea of not giving to organizations with large overhead. So some nonprofits have to be very careful with how they position themselves in this group. But again, giving circles and online platforms are really a lot of the main channels that donors of color choose to make and give their philanthropy through. Now, this chart is a little bit hard to see, but I do believe it provides a lot of good information. And one outcome of the report in this new normal is really the changing or the acknowledgement of the true definition of philanthropy. A new normal that is seen by donors of color is truly beyond charitable giving. And so the bar graphs in the different colors represent the different ethnic racial groups, but it's also categorized through charitable giving, donating goods, volunteering, crowdfunding and giving through social media, together combined and each separated, as well as donating blood. And so the expansion of including these as part of philanthropy is something that is new in how they see their support. Now, it is normal for us to consider charitable giving to be the top measure of philanthropy, but I ask that you also consider time, talent, testimony, in addition to treasure, because this is something that many that donors of color certainly identify. So I ask, how is your organization tracking those level of engagement beyond just the charitable giving? What are you doing to expand and bring new donors? How are you using their testimony of your current donors to attract those new donors? I participated in a webinar earlier today, and there is one organization that is actually calculating the value of a volunteer hour. And I thought that was unique to think about the fact that giving of your time, which is one of our most precious resource, is a way that a lot of our donors can choose to exercise philanthropy. So just thinking beyond just the check writing and the online giving to how you engage is a great way to cultivate and nurture those relationships to your organization. But overall, from this chart, donors of color certainly give through crowdfunding and social media. They see volunteering very high, donating goods. And what's also surprising is donating blood is another high bar of how they see philanthropy in the way they exercise it. Now, this chart is also good to kind of show the generosity across racial and ethnic groups. And so you see the different groups across the bottom and their likelihood to contribute charitably and the likelihood of them to typically crowdfund. And for the most part, about 2/3 of Black and Hispanic households and about half of Asian households do give to charitable organizations in a given year. Now, what's interesting in this report is when you control factors that impact giving, such as education and income, one of the things that the report cited is that everyone contributes to charities. And I know this isn't really a part of mainstream research, but donors across all ethnic and racial groups do participate in charitable giving and also in that broader definition of philanthropy. So I just wanted to also show and point out this fact that the report shared. So overall, the report did find some new normals that I thought were interesting. One, generosity exists among diverse communities in all forms, and that diverse donors are employing and adopting new tools and practices to exercise philanthropy. And technology is playing a larger role for diverse donors. So I would certainly recommend, if you don't have or haven't included a crowdfunding type campaign or have a really robust online platform that allows for mobile giving, you may be missing out on the ease and convenience to attract donors of color. The other finding of the report is that, for historically marginalized communities, they have truly done a great job of attracting donors of color to support the communities in need. And they were the ones, actually, the Asian American and African American, as well as the Hispanic communities, were the first to lead the efforts on supporting organizations that are specifically focused on racial and social justice. So just thinking about how your organization, if it does tie into those key thinking, you should be able to really craft a case for support to attract the donors. So the everyday donors of color report was really interesting. And just to give my bottom line, if you will, I do want to mention that donors of color are not a monolith. They come in all ranges and beliefs. And so while the report focuses on the research from the study, survey, and the focus groups, they did show that there is a presence of diverse modes of giving. Again, as I mentioned, if you haven't incorporated crowdfunding or those style of campaigns to create impact and to bring people together for change, I would certainly encourage you to do so. Giving circles and donor advised funds is another channel that you might want to think about incorporating as styles to attract new donors and to show not only the stewardship of the impact of their philanthropy. Trust, confidence, and transparency. How does your organization communicate this? This is really important, not only to make sure that when donors are giving of their treasure, that your organization is prudently putting the funds to use, but also demonstrating impact and sharing the good and the bad of how your organization is achieving its mission. The other ethical consideration that's in this space is tracking. And for those who are in prospect research, I know there is a conversation at the national level on tracking donors of color and what does that look like in your database and in your CRM. And then finally, as I alluded to earlier, organizations, we really have to think about broadening or adopting that broadened view of philanthropy. You know, we want the charitable giving, but we also need to think, as I mentioned, about time and volunteer hours, giving of their talent and serving in that capacity for your organization. And then finally, testimony. How do you think about them and encourage them to talk about your organization, but also reward that and applaud it and show appreciation for it? If you're not tracking all 4 of those in your database, I would strongly encourage you to do so, because you are missing out on how your donors see themselves engaging with your organization. So I want to touch a little bit on journalism, because I think most of us on this webinar are in some way focused on supporting organizations in this space. And so while I mentioned the shift in philanthropy, I do acknowledge that the field of journalism has experienced major disruption prior to 2020. And that disruption included the rise of social media and the competition for clicks, the pressure for rushed reporting and breaking news, and our 25-hour news cycle. Sometimes it feels that way to me. You know, fact checking and fake news and just trust in the media has declined. I mentioned that earlier in the session with the post that I saw on LinkedIn. You know, each of these show no signs of slowing down. And so representing not only the organization that you support in this space, but also the changing field of philanthropy will certainly be a interesting way to approach both and really help your organization increase and maximize its ability to raise funds through all of this is key. So what is the new normal? How do you incorporate your case for support to organizations charged with advancing through these different trends? And so as I spoke a little bit about donors of color, you know, thinking about reciprocity and the pathway for the next generation, however you can highlight that in any of your channels of communication will certainly attract them. And how do you distinguish yourself from other organizations in the space? And I certainly, you know, encourage you to think about how other similar organizations are doing the same thing and kind of learning from them and kind of learning best practices for them. But I did want to speak about that, and I'll kind of come back to it again later on in the presentation. But as an overall, I truly find, can't give it justice in this webinar, all of the great insights that the Giving USA report and the annual report of philanthropy, as well as the Everyday Donors of Color report share. I will also post in the chat links so that you can download the free infographic that Giving USA offers, as well as the site so that you can download the Everyday Donors of Color report for future understanding and a lot of great information that is housed in those 2 reports. But I also want to consider everything that we talked about and kind of thinking about what your organization should do to embrace and excel in this new normal of philanthropy. And so in 3 different lenses, by channel, level, and type. By channel, I'm thinking about the mechanisms of giving, you know, direct mail, web, your online presence, crowdfunding. How are the messages that your organization is sending being reinforced through each of these channels? And is your mission being received by donors? In some of my past roles, I've encouraged my team to make gifts to other organizations or institutions that are doing similar work to our institution and organization, or to those that we admire. I call it my version of market research. And we would share every time that organization would email us or send us a letter. It's amazing to see when you're on the other end, how much information is kind of coming at you when you are a donor to similar organizations. So I definitely would put a plug in for kind of doing your own version of market research. But I also would encourage you to think about how are others speaking about your organization? Again, that testimony piece. I think your current donors are your best donors and your best advocates to bring new donors to the table. And so what are the ways that you make that possible? And using the channels through direct mail, web, online and social media to amplify that is certainly great. Now, when I mentioned the level, I'm thinking about our annual gifts, principal gifts, planned gifts. Your organization should have a distinct strategy for each of these methods of giving, but they should be coordinated and have the message complement each other, especially with planned gifts. For some of the organizations, we are pushing more to incorporate a planned giving ask with an annual giving ask now, because it's never too early to start those conversations about estate giving and planned giving. So I would also encourage you to think about how you're promoting those options within your donor base. And so those are some methods that I would certainly recommend. And then major and principal giving, these are your larger transformational gifts. What is your big idea? What is it that you can have the donors partner and dream with you on what that type of investment can accomplish? So if you don't have those plans, I would certainly think about them. You never know when another Mackenzie Scott may come along and give you those transformational gifts, and being ready to tell your story and share the impact will certainly be key. Thinking about data-driven decisions, metrics matter. I believe it was Peter Drucker who's coined the quote, "If you can't measure it, you can't manage it." And to me, two of the most important metrics that define an organization's ability to raise money is their renewal rate and their upgrade rate. To me, the renewal rate shows the strength of your stewardship. How are you continuing to bring the same donors who have bought into your organization's mission year over year? But at the same time, are you upgrading them and increasing their giving? And now thinking about this new expanded view of philanthropy, how are you also tracking them talking about the organization or giving of their time? So I certainly would, again, recommend, if you can't, please start tracking that information in different bits so that you can have a good picture of how your donors are engaging, so that you can increase both the renewal rate and the upgrade rate. And I just list a few of the many resources that are available to continue this conversation. We talked about the report, the Everyday Donors of Color, but Indiana University and the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy has a lot of great research and information about women donors and just some of the motivations behind that. They have great an overview of a lot of drilling into the data on how donors are giving, especially now post-pandemic. And then Candid, the GuideStar, the Foundation Center merger is the largest source of information on philanthropic and nonprofit giving, or just overall information on our sector. So I would certainly recommend just looking and seeing. I know they have a good wealth of information on grants that match your organization's mission and being able to tap into those donors. And then finally, I put the ... in philanthropy networks because the Blacks in philanthropy, Hispanic in philanthropy, Asian American, Pacific Islander in philanthropy, these networks are great resources to tap into donors of color, learning their motivations, and really honing in on how you can attract them as donors to your organization. I just came across a report, The Aspirational Donor, Understanding and Engaging High Net Worth Donors of Color, that was produced a couple years ago, which also has some great insights about the broad landscape of high net worth donors of color over the last few years. So finally, I know I wanted to put a slide in to acknowledge your topics. As you signed up for this webinar, lots of ideas were generated and what you hope to gain in this presentation. A lot of people said new donors, generating ideas, building the asks, and expanding the donor base. And I hope I was able to speak to those mechanisms and channels throughout this presentation. Data tracking and metrics, questions to evaluate your organization's operations and how well you're fundraising. And I definitely echo, and I'm glad somebody mentioned data tracking. And again, the renewal rate, upgrade rate. I know there are others, the acquisition rate, and another personal favorite, the return on impact. We think of ROI as the return on investment, but what is your ROI, return on impact, that you're giving to your donors? DEI principles and fundraising was something that a lot of participants registering mentioned, and hopefully through the donor of color you report, you got a little bit of insight of what motivates them and some of the things that you should be thinking about with staying in the forefront, using crowdfunding and giving circles. The other thing that I came across that I wanted to share is latinxfunders.org is a great resource if you want to tap into the Hispanic community. There's the Latino Giving Circle that is also of a great resource. And I recently learned Hispanics in Philanthropy offers a platform and the ability to use their technology to create digital giving circles. So I certainly would encourage you, if you really want to increase your ability to reach donors of color, think about those networks and leveraging their resources for your organization. Sometimes it's not about reinventing the wheel, but just adding on to what is already established. So in closing, yes, there is a new normal in philanthropy. I hope this spoke to some of the trends that are speaking in that direction. I know we're going to open this up for questions in a moment, but I certainly want to hear from you if there's insights that you've seen in your organization or just things that you're kind of wondering how to position for your organization to maximize this philanthropy. Please reach out. I'm always interested in hearing and learning more in this space. And so I'm going to close and see if there's any questions. I know there's a few that came.
All right. Hello, everyone again. Rashonda, it's amazing you've changed backgrounds so quickly and outfits. We're going to open it up for some live Q&A. So I just wanted to both encourage you to post in the chat, but also to raise your hand and we'll bring you up on screen if you'd like to ask something. We're on Zoom and we did this intentionally, this conference on Zoom, so that we could see one another and be more collaborative and have a discussion about all this great work. So we do have a question in the chat from Frank. Is there a good source for what benchmarks are like specific to journalism fundraising regarding KPIs, renewal, and uprate?
I was trying to find a quick answer for that because I know I've had my rule of thumb throughout the different organizations that I worked for, but I don't know if it's specific to journalism. Ideally, I would say if you can get a renewal rate that's upwards of 70, 75%, even higher, you are doing a really good job of retaining your donors. But anything below 50, if you're losing half of your donors, I would be concerned. And would want to look at some of the stewardship strategies and the ways that you are really communicating to those donors. As far as an upgrade rate, that one, I think you can be a little bit more flexible. Sometimes, a high percentage may not be a good thing. If donors are rapidly increasing, there may be spontaneous circumstances. I sometimes call them the one-hit wonders. If they make this large gift and then back down, how does that affect your trends over the years? So I would really offer, if anyone else on the call has a good benchmark that they've tried to kind of get to. And then over the years, I would certainly recommend trying to grow both the renewal rate and the upgrade rate. And maybe think about a 5-year trajectory of where you want to be and to slowly kind of work towards that goal. So thank you, Frank, for asking that question. It is a good one to really think about how do you calculate those two percentages.
And I would also add, especially in the journalism space, to remember that this last year, 2020 in particular, was so crazy and folks were home. They were reading local journalism and the news in their community in ways they never had before. And so to be a little kind to yourself if your renewal rate isn't what you expected it to be or isn't what your past trends have been. I think we all saw these huge spikes in giving. And so, ensuring that those donors stay around is really, really important. But this was definitely an exceptional year. We have a question in here around the age spread for individual donors. So if you have a sense of, what the age demographics are related to folks who are generally philanthropic.
That is a really good question. Again, the Giving USA report doesn't, I think that's one of the difficulties is trying to extrapolate the donors and the ages of donors. There's certainly some ideas around the age of donors making, the transformational gifts, the 6 and 7 figure gifts. But I would also say that millennials, especially, they, again, thinking about that new definition of philanthropy beyond just the treasure, it's also been said that they give up their time and want to be involved with organizations. But I wouldn't discount any millennials or Gen Zs as those who aren't philanthropic by way of giving. And I think they would tend to be more tied to the crowdfunding and social and giving online or through the different third-party sites that we see, the GoFundMes and those type of things. I would also say, just thinking about age, one of the things we would do is when donors were kind of in their 40s, we would start to have that conversation about playing gifts, especially as they're up in their career, they've established themselves. That would be an ideal time. I would also offer to say that it's never too early, honestly, to talk about those conversations. But as far as a specific age, Giving USA does not have any data that is totally quantifiable on it. I know they see the generations as being philanthropic, especially the younger ones, but not necessarily making the transformational giving. And I don't believe the Everyday Donors of Color report spoke to age. Specifically, just more so the ethnic and racial background of donors. Is there changes over time? That is a really good question, again, because we can't really have concrete data on, as I mentioned earlier, by the age, but over time, I would imagine that it's probably what we would assume, but I just am afraid to say it without having the actual data to back it up. With the fact that have millennials grown in their giving, or the numbers or the dollars that they're giving? Is there a shrinking happening? And so I may, want to get back on that, because I haven't really seen a lot of trends over time versus just the overall idea of philanthropy, again, speaking to those two reports.
Great, thank you. We have a question in here from Sarah Lomax Reese about any trends you're seeing in funding for-profit organizations, but those that are doing community-centered work.
I haven't. And that's a new phenomenon of for-profit organizations doing, as you mentioned, community-centered report. I would imagine some of these organizations are probably self-funded, because they're for-profit. They're not necessarily getting the benefit of being a nonprofit organization. I know I am in the education sector, and that's something that we're starting to, pay a little bit more attention to than we have in the past, the for-profit educational institutions. But as far as nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations doing community-centered work, I would imagine that there is a mechanism for supporting those type of activities that don't rely on philanthropy. And because it's not nonprofit or charitable, it's hard to really gauge what the impact of those opportunities are. But it is something that we definitely want to keep our eyes out, and especially if there are organizations that are similar to yours that are for-profit, how can we, look and see if there's any movement in how they're attracting some of our donors or attracting some of the attention away from what our organizations represent and what they accomplish.
Thank you. I would also plug that from 4 to 5 today, Rusty Coates is doing a session on community chat around for-profit fundraising in journalism. So Sarah and anyone else interested should definitely attend. And of course, one of the things that makes the Giving USA report possible is that on the nonprofit side, all of that information has to be publicly reported. So a lot harder to measure on the for-profit side because there's not the same reporting requirements. But I think we'll have lots of great, hopefully, community insight in the 4 to 5 session today.
Yeah.
But thank you. Also, a question around donors. You mentioned earlier in the session, donors wanting to avoid giving to organizations with high overhead. Do you really find that that's still a thing? And if so, I would add to this, how do you combat that? How do you convince them that the mission is still quite worthy?
Yeah, it is a thing. It really is. It goes with that transparency and wanting to make sure that, when I give $1, that, how much of that is going to pay salaries, keep the lights on, pay for this shiny new magazine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it is something that we in the industry have to be mindful of, that it is the perception that we don't want it to seem as if we have, gifts going to other causes that aren't directly tied to our mission. I represent an institution with a very large endowment, and I always get that question, well, you have this large endowment, why do you need my gifts? And so what do we do about it is we really have to take the time to intentionally educate our donors on how their funds are being used, how it actually creates impact, how it moves the needle and helps us achieve our mission. And sometimes even differentiate between, this is how the overhead and the administrative costs are covered, and this is how gifts to our organization are covered. If you're not articulating that in any type of annual report, whether it's digital or print, I would certainly encourage you to do so, because that is something that you do want to make sure you maintain and grow as the trust among donors, current and future, on how funds are certainly being used. And I know Candid, I think it's the idea that donors are starting to look and do research when it comes to the ethical standards of some of our organizations. And I'm remiss at the coding that used to be with the foundation, being or Guide Star, and just being a higher ranked or a recognized nonprofit organization, kind of meeting their standards. So that is something else that you do want to be mindful of as it relates to just the perception and transparency and communicating to our donors.
And I would also remind you that your journalists are definitely not overhead. They are programmatic. And so it looks different in a more traditional nonprofit, in like a health and human service type nonprofit, but in the journalism space, salaries do not necessarily mean admin overhead. And to be really intentional about folks sitting behind a desk in journalism are doing the programmatic work. And so that's important. Continue to add questions in the chat or raise your hand. I do have one for you, Rashenda, while folks are getting their thoughts together. You talked a lot about how to engage, and we talked about this actually in the session in the Q&A that we're not watching this recording, but you talked a lot about how to engage donors of color. And for many media organizations, they have not necessarily best served the interests of the communities of color within their region and communities over time, and are now many trying to make really, really authentic, are trying to really authentically move in the direction of being more community-centered, better serving all the communities in their region. But I would imagine that often engaging donors of color can be a challenge when there's a lot of history that is not always so positive. I would love to hear your thoughts on that, especially as it relates to your work now at Emory compared to being at Spelman, where I imagine maybe you also sometimes deal with that same thing in higher education that could be very applicable to challenges that fundraisers may have in the journalism space.
Yes, I remember the question on the session, and I believe my answer was it's going to take time. It is going to be a slow process to build the trust. And it's going to take one of authenticity and really being honest about where we are and what has taken place, especially over the last year in history, as it relates to the different communities, across the country. And so I think tapping into leaders and getting the buy-in and in some way the stamp of approval is certainly the strategy to execute. But just knowing that it is going to be a consistent and it's going to be a marathon to try to engage the communities, build their trust, and then to even communicate how you are supporting that community through your organization. So whether it's journalism, I think there was a question about religious organizations and how do they, communicate within the Black church, because it is such a critical part of the community. And I just said it's going to take, the same consistent effort with leaders, maybe meeting with the leaders, explaining the mission, and just doing it over time, being consistent and persistent is really what it's going to take. But I don't have a formula or a recipe. If you do these 3 steps, it's really just going to have to be a unique approach for every different group that you're really trying to bring close to your organization. And again, one that's going to take a lot of time and consistency and transparency and acknowledgement of where we are and where you want the partnership or where the partnership can grow.
Great, thank you. I wanted to just point out a question, but point out Sarah Lomax Reese's really thoughtful comment, which is really important for us to remember that Black media has been doing this community-centered work with very little support from philanthropic and corporate communities for decades, centuries. And so it's also a matter of shifting, not just news organizations that have not served those communities well, shifting their work, but also the philanthropic community shifting their resources to the organizations that have been doing this work and doing it well, and serving communities of color for forever, and to make sure that their funding is also more equitable. So I know we're on the fundraising side, but I also think as a fundraiser, it's also really, we always want to go and get the gift or have that funder engage with us. But if that funder is coming into our community and engaging with media that's been doing that work authentically and serving that community for a long time, we as an ecosystem should, and as a media community, should be celebrating that. And so, we're metrics driven, we're goal driven, but I think that's also really important to make sure that funding is going to organizations that are really are currently and have been historically serving the needs of diverse communities.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I know it may not be possible, so I do want to acknowledge that and preface the statement, but sometimes partnership. There's the idea that, this organization and another, to your point of the Black media organizations that have been doing the work for years, is there any way that there could be a project or something that the two organizations can come together? And that way it is a mutual benefit for both organizations to have this experience. That's something that we're doing in the higher ed space, is looking at other higher ed institutions where, we may share donors, we may share, the same type of corporate entity. Why not? Why can't we come together and think about something big with that donor to show the alignment and the fact that, there is a new day in how we see our two institutions working together. So I'm not sure if that's translatable over in the news media organizations, but it is something that, could be a win-win when it comes to some of the large corporations. And even if there are donors who are really keen on supporting this space, how can you, have a little bit of synergy and win for both?
Yes, no, I think we see lots of lots of collaboration in journalism, and there definitely needs to be more, especially as it comes to philanthropic partnerships with funders. If there are, is there anything else, any other words of wisdom you'd love to leave us with? This has been so wonderful. We will make sure that all of the links are included from the chat today, are included in the shared Google Doc, so everyone has access to it after today's session as well.
No, thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining. My email, I'll put it in the chat as well. If you have questions, comments, feedback, it's really helpful. This is kind of one of those pet projects, if you will, really just digging in and really understanding the data and trends and how we can use it to inform future decisions and make, as I said in the video, the best data-driven decisions. So I appreciate everyone's time and also bearing with a little bit of the technical issues I was having, as we're in this new normal of Zoom and really trying to work through the technical challenges. But I'm glad that the presentation slides and the links will be shared with everyone. And of course, it has my email and I'll put it in the chat. But I love to hear from everyone. And thank you, Rebecca, again. And I hope the rest of the sessions today and tomorrow go very well.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your thoughts and your insight and all of your expertise and experience. I wanted to also highlight that at 2:30, we have a keynote, a fireside chat with Stuart Bainham and our CEO at the Lenfest Institute, Jim Friedlich, about his work in Baltimore, standing up soon to be the Baltimore Banner, a new news enterprise. And then there will be a little bit of a break and then a series of sessions from 4 to 5, including that community chat on for-profit fundraising. So we hope to see you all afternoon. For those of you on the West Coast, a continuation of your morning. So thank you all.